Welcome everyone. My name is Shauna McCabe and I'm the director of the Art Gallery of Guelph. And I'd like to welcome you all tonight. And thank you for joining us. And thank you, Catherine Blackburn, for being with us tonight. I'll start by offering a land acknowledgement on behalf of the Art Gallery of Guelph, where we are hosting this dialogue tonight. This statement is crucial for art museums as land acknowledgements acknowledge and recognize the ongoing effects of colonialism that really underpin these institutions. Not only have museums utilized deeply colonial methods of representation, but because of their authority, these narratives have often been accepted as truth, informing destructive policies that have negatively impacted Indigenous peoples. Guelph, Ontario is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit and Métis people today. And as we gather here this evening, we'd like to acknowledge that Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people, and more recently, the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We recognize the significance of the Dish with One Spoon covenant to this land and offer our respect to our Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis neighbors. As we are gathered virtually here today, connected and yet physically dispersed, it's also a good moment to reflect on the significance of place wherever we are, and in doing so, recognize how different traditional lands we reside in and move through inform our lives. We acknowledge our elders, past, present, and emerging of these lands with gratitude and respect. A couple of details. Everyone has their microphones muted to avoid disruptions during the talk. And if you do have questions, please add them to the chat and we will address them towards the end. And please feel free to do that at any point. And I'd like to acknowledge our guest tonight, Catherine Blackburn. Catherine was born in Île-à-la-Croix, Saskatchewan, and which exists in close proximity to Pachinak, Saskatchewan, a place that holds the key to much of her work. She is a member of the English River First Nation with Dene and European roots. And as well, she grew up in Choiceland, a community in rural Saskatchewan, and today lives in Terrace, British Columbia. Her work, as you will see, and as many of you already know, embraces two key inspirations, family and culture. And through these two lenses, she's able to address the complexities of memory, history, and cultural identity. The other distinctive aspect of her work is her commitment to merging contemporary concepts with elements of traditional Dene culture, exploring the significance and history of certain materials and practices through their changing resonance in the context of colonialism. And what we'll talk about today is the development of her work, from earlier to the New Age Warrior series, which the gallery has had on view here since January, as well as more recent work. And I guess, actually, I wanted to read something. The other thing that Catherine is an amazing writer and very articulate about her work. And I thought this was actually a passage that was part of your T and Bannock piece on beadwork. And just this one paragraph where you say, with this liberation, my work processes have become more freeing. Using traditional materials and techniques, I've twisted the rules just enough to allow me to play. My beadwork is photo-based, incorporating transfers, sometimes as a tool and others as a base for my design. No matter the final outcome, my goal remains constant. The direct relationship of my European and Dene heritage challenges me to create innovative work that encourages dialogue between traditional art forms and new interpretations of them. These are the tools I use to create, and with those in mind that I hold near and dear to my heart, I am inspired to create messages of kinship and resiliency. And I thought that it's so articulate, and I know, you know, much of your work is also autobiographical, so much more of your biography will come out as we talk about your work. And that passage also really speaks strongly to this and powerfully to this first slide, which is kind of a great starting point because it speaks to sort of your interest in textile in one sense, but also about the body. And maybe you want to start here.
Sure. Thank you so much, Shauna, for the beautiful introduction, and thanks for having me. And thank you everybody for joining. And yeah, I guess we'll just dive right into it. I thought this body of work was a good place to start. This work is titled Our Mother's Tongue. And there's a few slides that I'll show you of this work itself, but I thought it was a good focus in terms of bringing together my work in adornment, referencing the body, referencing language, and through these threads, speaking to cultural identity and these larger explorations within my practice. And so, yeah, this quite literally brings those together in a sense. For this work, I used, as you just mentioned in that little excerpt, I use gel photo transfers in the creation of this particular body. Yeah, I don't know how many are familiar with the process of it. It's quite simple, but just using acrylic gel medium and layering over top of a photo, rubbing the back of the photo off. And so you're left with this like gel skin to work with. And from there, I mounted it on a piece of canvas, and then I was able to work back into the work. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, this work is bringing together all these different aspects of my practice. This work was made in 2018, and there are two kind of smaller bodies, I guess, within this larger one. So this is framed work that you're seeing here, of which I've beaded the Dene language back onto the tongue. This tongue in particular is my mother's. And in the next slide, I've incorporated a photo of the other small body of work within this, which was 5 pin cushions. So I did 5 cushions and 5 framed works. And I guess the more intense story behind this work is it refers to a story I had read or had come across at one point in regards to residential schools, and this being a form of punishment if Indigenous children were to speak their language in these schools. Sometimes their tongues were pierced with pins. And so there's a relationship here that I'm diving into, a familial connection, my mom being a residential school survivor, and the complex nature of language and language loss. And there's not a straightforward explanation or solution to why I don't know my language, why I can't speak my language. So I think I'm in this work, I'm working through trauma. I'm working through my own trauma. I'm referencing family trauma and intergenerational trauma, but I'm also considering the other side of this work, which is about resilience and beauty and Indigenous beauty and adornment and all that encompasses. And so as such, I've beaded back into the 4 of the framed works with floral pattern. And these aren't any particular floral patterns, but I am referencing floral motif found on Dene garment, traditional Dene garments, such as moccasins or mitts, of which my grandmother used to make, my late Setsune. And so, yeah, it's about loss and language loss, but it's just as much about beauty and resilience and power and sovereignty and all those complex themes surrounding such a heavy occurrence, you know. And I don't know, maybe it's worth just mentioning too, because I don't know if it's that apparent, but you might have to view this work all in the same place, because to understand that the words found on my mother's tongue in slide 1 are all found on the other 4 tongues in these framed works. And that is contributes to the sense of dialogue. My mom being able to teach us the language and us repeating it on our tongue. So there's this, dialogue that I wanted to create, that although, we don't know our language, there's other ways of celebrating ourselves and our identities. So.
Mhm. And the syllabics get picked up in New Age warriors as well.
Yeah.
Sort
And
of,
different kinds of syllabics in that one as well. This one was, specifically Dene, of course, but yeah, you're right. So through this work, I was really intrigued as I was making it of the direct correlation to the act of stitching, this labor of love, because adornment and beading is a labor of love that's deeply rooted in community, love for one another, a mother's love for her family and community, because it was mainly females within Indigenous communities that would bead and adorn, but that's changed, and it's much more inclusive of everybody now. But I was really became a little bit obsessed with this idea of what I was doing. I was taking the skin of this acrylic gel medium that literally felt like a skin, and I was stitching through it. And there was a permanency that was being described, and it reminded me so much of Indigenous tattooing and marking in this way. And so I had come across a bunch of different photos, but I included this one. This one's actually Amy Malboof, an artist I really look up to as well. And this is her markings on her back. And I believe she received these by Dion Kazis. I could be wrong on that, but this technique found on her back on the right here is called skin stitching. And since creating this slide long ago, I actually have received my own markings. And so I was really drawn to this specific type of mark making, which is taking a needle, attaching a thread, dipping the thread in ink, and literally sewing below the skin surface, and that ink being dispersed under the skin. So I just became more and more, I guess, enthralled with the relationship to one another, and did more research afterwards. So I threw this slide in because I don't know how many people know, but I have a jewelry business as well. It works in tandem with my practice in the sense that they're intrinsically linked, being beadwork, being adornment. I don't separate them in a sense in my head. However, I do separate them in terms of how they function differently apart from each other, one being a business, more business oriented. And so it's been really beautiful to blur that line within my practice, to not separate them, not have them categorized so much as I used to see that they have so many similarities, right, between my visual practice and my the jewelry I make for business. But it definitely was the start of my introduction to beadwork. I'm trying to think back as to when I first made anything with beads, and I believe it was 2008. And so I've grown up surrounded by beads my whole life. My grandmother's and my late grandmother is a phenomenal beadwork artist. So I was always surrounded by beads and beadwork and garment making and the process of hide tanning. And but I had never actually learned from her. I learned from a friend, Kirsten Ryder from Morley, Alberta, and she taught me two thread applique, the same technique my grandma would have used. And from there, I just started making little, pairs of earrings and gifting them and whatnot. And little did I know at the time that that would lead me into a textile-based practice that is predominantly, beadwork based. So it's kind of the beginnings of it. However, these two photos are not my first projects, so don't feel frustrated if you're just starting to bead.
I like to, I mean, every biography of yours says, you describe yourself as a contemporary beadwork artist. And but it's at the same time, your emphasis on tradition, right? And sort of the ancestral practices you've inherited are so much part of that definition of contemporary beadwork art.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You keep those things in tension throughout.
I think it's also important too, and I'll probably speak to it more, but the power of dress and the power of fashion, and generally speaking, and how it's transformative in a sense. And so I also look at my jewelry practice, in comparison to that as well, or like in relationship to that. And so I think it's more me unlearning how to this idea of compartmentalizing everything, right? And more finding the veins and how it all comes together within my work. So this is just a reference photo. I speak about Indigenous tattooing and marking. It also included piercing, jewelry, adornment of the body in all these different ways. And so it very much is a historical expression throughout Indigenous communities. And so at the time of missionaries, the first Catholic missionaries, or not just Catholic, but missionaries in general, there was a banning of these practices, many different types of cultural practices, including ceremony, song, dance, art, and tattooing and adornment. It was all part of it, right? So there's a definite resurgence and resistance as well to the work that I do, and having that work be based in adornment is a really special place, I think, for me to center and focus that power that's found in dress and in adornment in that sense. So this is just a still from a performance piece that I had done. This was in February, I believe, of 2019. So right before COVID. This was my last bigger body of work that exhibited in College Gallery, Saskatoon, University of Saskatchewan. I had done a residency show there, and this was really important for me at the time. Like I had mentioned previous, I had been learning and researching more about Indigenous mark making, Indigenous tattooing, and had drawn the conclusion that my Dene ancestors would have received many of these same markings. My family doesn't have any facial tattoos or traditional markings that I know of. But I know that it has roots in the Dene community. So it was something that I knew I had wanted to receive at some point, but it was one of those things that I felt it would come to me at the right time instead of me, trying to chase something. And so there's definitely been a resurgence in tattooing and Indigenous mark making. And so I was put in contact at one point with a few artists, but this is artist Stacey Fant. Hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Stacey. And she is based in Regina. And so she and I had a couple sessions where she had done some mark making on my shins. And this one in particular was a marking on my face that I wanted to be part of my solo exhibition for this residency. And so this actually happens within the gallery space. and we invited people to come join, to come watch. And yeah, it was a powerful process, and especially being in a settler colonial institution, it really begged for these, I think it was a way of trying to create a dialogue, or maybe just more of an awareness, or just to question these institutions on the responsibilities that they hold, in terms of reflecting Indigenous voice, Indigenous body, especially on Indigenous lands. And so it was important for me to have that happen in a space like this. Yeah. These, man, these are old now. These are called, this is a pair of mucklucks I had made back in, I have it written somewhere, I believe it was 2012, might have been 2013. But they're called The Ties That Bind. And at this time, I was, like I mentioned earlier, I was always surrounded by my grandmother's work and her incredible gift of garment making. And she made mucklucks similar to this. This is kind of her style that I've mimicked. And she mentored me through this project. It was one of the first art grants I had received from the Saskatchewan Arts Board. And I knew I wanted to incorporate portraits and strong women in my life. And so on the left, so on the right, the picture on the right, on the left-hand side is my mom's portrait, and on the right is my sister's. And on the backs of each, I have, so the picture on the left, but the right side is the Churchill River, which is where my community of Pachinak is based, right along the Churchill River. And on the left is Prince Edward Island. And that was a representation of the East Coast, where my sister is now based. At the time, she had a cabin there, but yeah, that is a representation of her home at the time. But also, it speaks to a family history as well. My dad being from Eastern Canada, and my grandfather and grandmother on my dad's side being born in Halifax. And it's interesting because when I don't know if when I was creating this piece, if I really understood the level of disconnect that I was also navigating in this work. And that being that I didn't have strong connections to either place. The place that I was born, I didn't grow up in Pachinak, and my dad's side of the family were provinces away, and we rarely got to see them. So I think I was really navigating this idea of like home, and I continue that navigation still to this day. You know, what is home to me? How do we define home for ourselves, but also homelands, and that being I don't know, like I guess it's a complex theme for me that I still consider in my practice. I think now it becomes more about community and where I feel at home with community, and that can be enough, right? So yeah, it was definitely a difficult project. I mean, technically very difficult as well. So I'm glad I had my grandmother's input and guidance in that yeah, way.
We also see these ideas that continue, you know, I think this work we showed actually when I was directing the Textile Museum of Canada, and they struck me then, but I've noticed, knowing and seeing your work since, that these ideas of family and women and resilience and strength, and then also the different forms that land and home can take, that seems to recur, you know, from this point on.
Yeah, definitely.
they capture sort of what continues to be your investigation.
Mhm, mhm.
And they're wearable, like you said, they sort of come back to this idea of the wearability of
Yeah,
the work. Yeah.
yeah. I've learned a lot technically too. Like I learned pretty quickly after making this work. I remember I beaded on canvas or linen. And when I brought it to my grandmother for the construction part, she was like, oh, what are you doing? Never do that again. So yeah, I've come a long way since then as well, just technically speaking. But as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, my work is deeply personal at times, but it is almost always focused on my family history and my culture. And so I thought it important to include a couple pictures of this would be on the right, my first cousins, my first cousins, and I believe there's quite a few of us missing. So it's a large family, and we don't get together very often, and usually when we do, it's kind of unfortunate events. There's usually a death, but within it, we spend time together through the 3-4 days of a wake, and it's a really beautiful time just to reconnect with everybody. And so yeah, it's kind of special, even as sad as the occasion may be. But yeah, that's the majority of them anyway. And then on the left is my late Setsune, my grandmother. That would have been on my wedding day. So I thought I'd include a few paintings. It's really all I've ever done is a few paintings within my practice. It's not to say I don't love painting, I really do. My arts practice really did start, or my career, I guess, kind of started in painting. It was short-lived. I found I was gravitating towards beadwork at this exact same time. I was creating some floral panels in beadwork to kind of accommodate these paintings that I was working on at the time. But these are two paintings from a body titled Return. And I'm guessing a lot of people know the painter Kehinde. Am I saying his name right now? Kehinde Wilde?
Wiley.
Thank you, Wiley. And his work is just phenomenal. And I remember being so drawn to it at the time. The way that he captures with the richness and color, design, this way of monumentalizing the person within the frame. It's just outstanding. And so I was really inspired by the color palette, of course, the use of floral and floral motif within this body of work. And I don't think I understood at the time exactly what maybe these particular paintings were speaking to, but I clearly had taken, these are photos and more of a snapshot type of photo. And I think I was really resisting that idea of how so often we're portrayed as people of the past. You know, we're so used to like the Edward Curtis style of seeing our families and communities and people, and they're not colorful, right? They're sepia toned or black and white, and it always is this referral to the past. And I really wanted this work to speak to a vitality and a richness and a presence. So I think that's why I chose the colors I did as well. And the types of photographs that I worked from were, yeah, these snapshot images that I had collected over the years. So those are my references. And then these two paintings, these were made in, man, I don't have dates on any of my notes here. I believe these were 2015. And the painting on the left is titled My Goodbye, and the painting on the right is my grandmother on my dad's side. The title is Mrs. Mary Blackburn, Halifax Explosion Survivor, 1915 to 2010. And this work was meant to be, to include a third, and you kind of can see the portraits that hang behind me in my goodbye. There's my grandfather on the left and my grandmother on the right. And I never did finish the portrait of my grandfather. And I think in hindsight, I think it's because I didn't have a connection to my grandfather at all. He passed when I was 1, and I never had any kind of relationship with him. And so maybe there's a reasoning behind that, but it was just, it ended up being just the two paintings here. And yeah, it's, I think a way, again, that I was working through loss at this time. I had lost my grandmother, and like I spoke earlier, this disconnect from both sides of the family was really present at this time, and especially after losing her. And so I think I wanted to dive into a process, that being painting, that was very time consuming and gave me time with this person as I was creating it, right? And it was this way of trying to make up, I think, for a lot of loss. But yeah, she was a tiny woman. She'd sink into that chair. I remember when we go visit her, she was so small. So this work is titled Aboriginal Classics, and it's an ongoing series for me. I've created, I don't even know to date how many of these little tea bags, but I've played with different styles of them. I started off similar to the one on the left, using seed beads and formulating these little floral or plant patterns on them with seed beads. And some of my latest ones, such as the one on the right, that is one that includes porcupine quills. And I wanted to include quills. I've included quills in a few works of mine now, but they predate beads and the trading of beads. So prior to beads being an item of trade, anyone within the Porcupine belt would have utilized or could have utilized quills as a form of adornment, saying that it is a very time-consuming process, especially if you're doing natural plant dyes to get those colors within quills. It's very intricate work, and there's dozens of different ways that you can create with quills. So this was just one of the ways, and I basically used them as beads where I would cut them into whatever size I needed, and then I'm applying them through the hollow of the quill itself to tack it down. So a very similar process to the one on the left. It just has a very different aesthetic. I've since done some of these little tea bags with tufting, animal hair tufting, so caribou hair specifically. And so I'm not sick of them yet. They bring me joy, but I've done enough of them now. So I'm kind of giving them a little bit of a break, but the reason I had titled this work Aboriginal Classics was a reference to this generalizing of Indigenous people under this, large umbrella, and not defining us as these unique, sovereign, very diverse nations. And I think just being really frustrated with it. And so I kind of taken that idea along with this idea of commodification of product, and also happening at this time and continues to happen in so many different ways, is this commodifying culture. One example being dream catchers, of course, another being sage bundles, whatever is the next cool trend that makes a quick buck. People are not hesitant to commodify culture in that way. And so it really kind of is this play on that idea that you know, these little tea bags, these little vessels hold these medicines that I've picked from the land, that I've made offerings back to the land. And so they become these, not so much sacred, but they become these medicine bundles in a sense. And the idea that it's in this tea vessel form, ready to be consumed. So this idea of consuming culture in that way.
How many
So
are
I
there?
don't, what's that?
How many are there now?
I want to say there are 20 or more. There might be more. I know I have a list that I'm inventorying them all now. But yes, some have been purchased or acquired by other galleries, and others are in private collections. But I never thought that this work would be a continuous body of work for me at the time that I created my first 6. And they've also been a really nice way to make my work accessible, in a sense that they're not, you know, they're not at a high price point like other works. So yeah, more
And
accessible for the average buyer.
we have rat root in our collection here.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And so do all of the plants actually refer to northern Saskatchewan? Is that
That's where it started.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where it started. And I was very careful with acquiring that knowledge too. There are some medicines that are sacred and they're not meant to be revealed and, you know, passed along in that way. And there are certain medicine men and women in these communities that hold this knowledge. And so it was very important for me, obviously, to not disrespect and not, you know, tread that line. So it was, I went to my mother for the majority of what could be used in this collection, as well as my grandmother at certain points in time. So it did expand. This collection has expanded to include some BC plants now. So where I'm based, there's actually a trail that I'm quite familiar with, and they have these little posts beside the plants themselves on the trail, and it explains the traditional Indigenous medicine uses of each plant. And so that kind of became like a second phase of that, or an extension of medicines for me, utilizing some BC plants. But yeah, it's like I said, maybe I'll just end up running out of plants. I don't know. Maybe that'll be the end of the series. But oh, and I should maybe mention too, sorry, those works also utilize birch bark for the tags themselves, and sinew that was gifted to me from my grandmother. I've since run out of that sinew, so I've had to find other, but the sinew is on the little string that holds the tag. This is just a reference photo before the next slide, and it I just wanted it in reference to porcupine quill work and the multitude of ways that you can stitch or utilize quills. And the image on the left utilizes, I believe it's called straight stitch, as well as zigzag stitch. And the image on the right is zigzag stitch and I believe rope stitch. There are dozens of stitches for quill work, and quill work would have been a medium that my family would have utilized as well. So that's why I gained interest in quills themselves. My grandmother believes that my late grandmother believes that she once quilled, but it would have been so long ago for her that she actually couldn't recall. So at this point in time, when I was doing this kind of research for this next project, I was trying to get in contact with someone that still practiced quill work within my community. And the only elder that was around at the time was 102 years old. And so by the time I got my shit together. This person had passed on. And so I had taught myself, I basically had taught myself from a book how to quill. Now, I only learned one stitch. So I can't say I'm a master quill worker at all, but I learned the zigzag stitch. It was the only stitch I did not fail completely at. And I created this piece that I titled Self-Portrait. And yeah, it's the zigzag stitch. It's done on moose hide. I harvested the quills myself for this project, and I hand dyed them, but I didn't, not natural dyes. I used fabric dyes for these. And yes, it was quite the process. It tests patience. It is a incredible labor of love for anyone that uses quills. They understand exactly what I'm talking about. It's time consuming. You have to be, yeah, it's quite the process. So I thought I would take on what I thought was a small project at the time, which I think this measures 12 by 13 inches approximately, which is a very, very large piece to quill. So I was kind of happy when it was done. I was rushing to get this piece done for exhibition, and I really haven't touched quills in this sense, in this zigzag stitch technique since I got my fill. But with this work, I think I was really playing with this idea of melding this traditional form of making with a portrait style that I had layered in Photoshop. And the reason I had done it that way was to really contrast those colors, because with quill work, you're basically working in rows or in lines. And so there's not a whole lot of shape or rendering that you can do within smaller areas, hence why I expanded it to the size I did, and yeah, really blocked in those colors. So this is a work that I created. So that's me on the right hand side with my piece, and that's my grandmother, Christine, on the left hand side. And in the corner of her photo, there's also another little photo I included of her, and that would have been when she was much younger, and she's working on a hide in that picture. So for those that aren't familiar, this is a traditional technique when used when prepping a hide before you use the hide for garment making or whatever you're going to use the hide for. It's a extremely, like, the process is incredible, from harvesting the animal to skinning to fleshing, and then to smoking after this process. It's again a massive labor of love, and kudos to all of those people out there doing it. And there's there's also been a resurgence in this as well, and it's not that it had ever died, but there are a lot of young men and women doing this now, and it's extraordinary. So I used to just watch my grandmother. She was just a perfectionist at everything she did, but I wanted to include that photo there just in reference to how I've framed my piece on the right, and that yeah, has a historical meaning or traditional meaning for me, just in how I framed that work. And the excerpt that you read from at the beginning, I had just included, you can find the process that I talk about making this work through tianbannock.com, and it kind of just reveals maybe a little bit of the behind the scenes process for me, and the writing I did to accommodate and reflect on this work after it was finished. And I think yeah, here's a close-up of it. So it's titled, "But There's No Scar?" Question mark on that. It's a piece from 2018. And I similar to the first slide I presented, Our Mother's Tongue, this work again is me processing trauma and pain. This is a bruise that I've replicated using beads. And not everyone sees the bruise right away, which I find really interesting. People see many different things in this piece, especially if it's at a distance or depends on how close you're standing to the work. But yeah, I was really working through pain, my own family trauma, historical trauma, to an extent speaking to collective trauma, but watching my step in that. My work, or some bodies of work that I create, are really on this. There's a fine line between what is mine to share, what is mine to offer in terms of the viewer consuming. So it always comes back to asking myself those questions in these heavier bodies of work. And I usually navigate it through a personal story or personal experience. And some of them takes a while. This one definitely took a while for me to explore this idea before I dove into it. But yeah, I used beads to create this bruise. It's applied to deer skin, and it's stretched on these poles. So like I said, that traditional way of framing a piece. Yeah, I don't know if maybe you have any questions about that piece specifically, Shauna, but if you do, you feel free.
Yeah. I remember you said once it was like you knew you wanted to create another one. You felt a loss as soon as it was collected, right?
Mm-hmm.
You created another one.
Yeah. Kind of, yeah, phase 2, I guess, of the work. I think it was one of those works too that I wasn't quite, I mean, any artist is happy when they sell their work, of course, and when they know it's going, it will be stewarded in the right way, and then it'll have a good home. But it was one of those pieces that maybe I hadn't fully quite worked through everything I needed to work through. And then I felt like, okay, well, now I'm saying goodbye to this piece and I don't feel quite ready. So I did know I wanted to include it in a phase 2 in some way. And that ended up being what happened next. But yeah, it's a dark, it speaks to a historical colonial past, this work. Most definitely, it speaks to intergenerational trauma. But again, the flip side of that is that to not get caught in that trauma, to work past it, to work through it. And for me, that's through my art, right? But it's also through these indigenous ways of understanding and these indigenous knowledges that aid in that process. And so yeah, it's a hard navigation at times, and this was one of those pieces that.
Well, it strikes me too that you're using the same sort of materials, the seed beads that are, the same colors, the same kind of materials you're using for floral patterns, for example. So to cut there's this element of beauty, right? That's to the beads themselves. And so when you use them in this way, and also to kind of, I know that you photographed it outside here, which gives it this sort of the natural context also kind of adds to the beauty of it.
Right.
Okay? So yeah, it's interesting. And then when you did the second phase, it's a garment, right? Is it?
Yeah.
Something to wear.
Yeah, it is interesting. Right. Yeah. I actually made those notes yesterday. So like, there's some threads here again. Yeah, definitely. I'm glad you said that too, because other people see possibility within this. And I think it's when you're close up to the work too, which I know not everyone has had the chance to experience with certain works, but this was purchased by the National Gallery of Canada, and it was actually in exhibition in the Abbotswana exhibition in I'm blanking already on when that was, 2018, fall of 2018. And so I actually got to revisit this work in that gallery, and it was really a beautiful moment too, just to see others looking at it, the perspectives, and how people would get lost, I think, in the beads themselves. Like you said, there's a beauty to it. You know, some are shimmering, others are matte, and there's this like play of design within it itself. I've heard others mention fingerprints when they're close up to it resembling a fingerprint, which I thought was really interesting, and of course plays back into these themes of identity. But yeah, I think it's also really important to speak to that beauty and that strength and that resilience, and working past that trauma, like I said. And so at the time, at the second phase, I took it off the stretcher of which it was framed before sending it off to the gallery. And I got my my friend Tennille Campbell. I collaborate with her quite often, and she's also a cousin of mine. Shout out to Tennille. And she's an amazing photographer, and I told her what I wanted to do with this piece, and she shot the photo on the right for me. So it's me in that photo with the piece itself draped on my back. And like you said, it becomes a garment. It becomes a garment, which is really interesting now as my practice is really full circling back to some of those first, the mukluk piece, for example, right? It's becoming about wearable work again, and garment wear, and fashion to an extent, and beauty, and all of those things. So yeah, I wanted to wear the work, and I got my hair braided for the occasion, and those are extensions. Sorry to burst anyone's bubble that thought that was my real hair, but I wanted to indicate in some way that my Indigenous identity, and I thought the braids were a nice way to do that, and so they draped down over the piece themselves. But it can also speak, because I haven't shown my face, it becomes anonymous in that sense, but it's also maybe more relatable, or maybe speaks to a collective experience, with me not, identifying myself in the photo. But yeah, there's a beautiful piece. I don't know if I have time to read it or not, but when I was making this work, or actually it was after I'd made this work, I didn't really know how to speak about it at first. It was very heavy for me. And years later, I came across the work of Quill Christie Peters, who I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but she's just an exquisite writer and painter and artist and person. And I found a small excerpt from one of her works that she titles Decolonial Love Letters to Our Body. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it. And I thought it was a nice relationship to this piece for me. The anger builds up in you and I from time to time. They talk about reconciliation, but foreclose any spaces that allow us to feel whole. After the residential schools, a generation was created that invented new ways to accept and process broken love. Even as small children, we recognize genocidal intent, carefully charting our realities in alignment with this colonial project, shape-shifting and dancing around our parents' broken bodies so that they could feel a little more loved, a little more whole, even if that meant sacrificing parts of ourselves that needed that love reflected back to us. Us Anishinaabe, always inventing technologies to resist. Us Anishinaabe, intelligent power beyond their wildest dreams. They didn't realize that even children are ancestors and homelands and spirits and dreams, that we always have the ability to call on the knowledge we have stored away in our flesh since time immemorial. So I thought it was a nice relationship and a nice way of kind of closing or understanding that work for me. But yeah, I think she's just a brilliant writer and artist. So I hope she doesn't mind me sharing that.
Thank you for sharing it.
Okay, so New Age warriors. Holy smokes. Yeah, this is a large body of work. As you can see, I just did a little kind of like split screen scenario here on this slide. You can see the relationship I have to the color palette in terms of the regalia shown at the top and my work at the bottom. And at this point in time on this slide, the photo at the bottom only includes 6 of the pieces. I believe there was a total, oh my gosh, I always blank on this. There might be 9, but for the runway event, I had split this work into 12. And so there was quite a few more pieces that came after this initial image here that you see. But yeah, this body of work is New Age Warriors. This is what you're currently hosting at your gallery, of course. And this work, I guess, time-wise, I'll speak a little bit to that and you'll see the process, but it was a 2-year in the making work for me. And it was very challenging at times, but at the time that I knew I wanted to do this, I was really focused on representation. Also really wanted to include this sense of diversity, of innovation within the work. And so it formulated itself into these wearable works. And that wasn't intentionally, I didn't know if that was going to happen with the work itself. It's such a, I'll kind of leave some of it to talk about, but I didn't know at that time that this would become a wearable work for the runway. So it's really interesting to see this work do that, and again come full circle back into a practice that speaks to adornment of the body for me. So yeah, this is the beginnings of it. I thought I can't not mention my grandmother and her inspiration in this body of work, as I mentioned so many times already through this slide. My grandma's just an incredible woman, and she made her own garments, she tanned her own hides, and she was always working away at her table, and she's really the epitome of strength for me, and where I focus a lot of my work is from the brilliance in culture, in Dene culture, in innovation and garment making. And so really important for me to include my grandmother here. Now, just going to check my notes here. So for these works, so for this body of work, I should say, I created both garment wear in terms of bodice pieces that could actually be worn on the body, and then the medallions. And the medallions come in different forms. Some of them are worn around the neck, others, I call them medallions, but they're in the form of headpieces. So here you see kind of a combination of the work. And also for the medallion portions, I've included glass seed beads as well. So the majority of the garments are made using perler beads. For those that aren't familiar, they're these little plastic beads that are a kid's craft, and you melt them together using an iron. and that's how they kind of fuse and bond to each other. So when I initially had plans for this body of work, it was overwhelming, of course, and I thought, how on earth would I ever create these art pieces or these armor pieces using glass beads? I simply don't have that kind of time. That would take me years. And so that's when I came across this idea of perler beads. And so I traded in the glass beads for these plastic beads, and away I went, navigating through 2 years of a labor-intensive but really rewarding body of work for me. Yeah, there was a lot of calculation in the forming of this work. But just to introduce this slide particularly, this is Alison Whitman on the left, also known as Miss Chief of Change, as I refer to her. She is the Community Resource Coordinator for File Hills Quill Tribal Council, part of the Health Services Youth Leadership Team. She is Dakota, Cree, and Soto from Cowessess First Nation. And her piece incorporates ideas of this beaded dance crown, and also ideas of an Inuit snow visor. And I wanted to take those two ideas and mesh them together. And this is the result of that. I've also included horsehair for the tassels that hang from the headpiece itself. And on the right, we have Jill George, also known as the Front Runner Fighter. She is a member of the English River First Nation. She is also my cousin. Jill is a student in the Masters of Physical Therapy, as well as a co-coach in the Brain Sport Running Academy at Wanaskewin. Her medallion reads Kwe, meaning woman in Ojibwe, and this medallion was made in collaboration with Melanie Parsons. And yeah, it's for this work, I really wanted to center Indigenous women in my life. And so I went to women who I obviously had a relationship to, but that they also had a relationship to community in some sense. You know, it could be frontline work, it could be behind the scenes, it could be youth work, whatever the case may be. I really wanted to highlight these women and to make them feel monumental, to have them adorned in this rich color palette, to feel present and powerful and all those things. And so here are two of them, and these are two of the photos that are included in the exhibition itself. And these are done in large format scale, and these are taken by Tennille Campbell, who, like I mentioned earlier, I collaborate with quite often. So this was the fun process. So many of you may be familiar, but you can buy these perler beads in these big jugs, and they come with assorted colors. And then the top row there that you see in the middle are the little templates that come in these packages. And you place these beads down, and then you use this paper when you're ready to iron, so you're not melting the beads, and you iron over top of them. And that's yeah, that's the kids' craft, that's the instructions for it. Now, when I went to make mine, of course, my garments weren't able to fit on these small little templates. So I had to be a little bit innovative, and this took at least a month for me to figure out a way that was going to, you know, I could operate and be efficient in it in some sense. So I, of course, wasn't going to sift through a huge jug of assorted beads. I went straight to the perler company and started ordering these bags that were already, you know, certain colors. And then I took, what do you call those things? Like lint roller sticky sheets, and began to double side tape those down to a surface. So I eventually realized, like, I can't just use my dining room table for this for 2 years straight. So I would I would sticky tape them to cookie sheets. And then I could draw on the sticky roller sheets themselves, could draw my pattern down. And because they were just sticky enough, I could place the beads on there, and they would, you know, be somewhat stable before I ironed them. And this process also allowed me to create curvatures in my shapes. It really opened the process up in terms of what I could do and the designs that I could formulate by changing it up a bit. But yeah, it was trial and error. Like I said, I think just that finding that was roughly a month, and then started to dive into my first piece. But in total, I worked on these pieces for the full 2 years. So on and off, of course, but started to go crazy by the end of it with these pearly beads. But
When you see, I mean, when you see the exhibition and the full set of armor, of gear, basically you realize, you know, and we were talking about it earlier, sort of they are resilient. They're, you know, the fact that they're durable, they have this flexibility, they're built so well that, you know, the labor involved
yeah,
constructing these is very clear.
yeah, it was interesting too, because another roadblock was how to, oh my goodness, I'm just like, sorry, my mind's actually going back, putting me at that table right now, and I'm like overwhelmed. I had to figure out how they still could be malleable, but still be fused well enough that they were still, you know, malleable. And then I found that when you iron both sides of them, they become stiff. And so certain things maybe I wanted to hold that form, so I would melt both sides of it, but the majority of this work is only melted on the one side, and that's so it had the capacity to wrap around the body and you know, move in certain ways. But yeah, you're right, it was very resilient material, and I'm glad I figured it out, because holy smokes, long process. Here's just a close-up shot, so you can kind of get an idea. And this is part of a cradle board that you'll see in the next slides, but here it is on the slide on the right, or the photo on the right. So a large part of the beginning phase of this work was the research, the historical referencing, and to create something that didn't dive into costume and being costumey, because then we're dealing with a whole other set of problems. And so I was continually working and stepping back, and then getting new eyes on a piece, and continually judging, you know, what I was doing, what I was incorporating. And it became very, very overwhelming, because I am trying to speak to a diversity, as mentioned, that is not my own, right? Like I'm Dene, but how can I possibly speak to all these different nations that I'm trying to showcase? So one way that I began was to go back and do as much research as I could. But when that became overwhelming, it actually led me to collaboration. And that's another really powerful aspect of this work, is the amount of collaboration that that happened throughout its creation. And so this is just kind of an example of my process, or you know, how I mimicked certain ideas within my work. And this is a traditional cradle board on the left hand side. Certain nations might refer to it as a papoose, others a moss bag. There are different variations of this apparatus that would carry a child. And then there's mine on the right, that I created, of course, with no child in there for the runway show. That would have been spectacular. And here it is again. So this is Devon Fiddler, the water hen weaver. as I've named her. And this is her son, Tucker, who was just a baby at the time. And yeah, I wanted this work to incorporate large scale portraits, like I mentioned. And so this was doable to have Tucker in this for the sake of a photo. The behind the scenes of these photo shoots was really incredible, speaking to that resilience of the models that I chose or that were involved. This, for example, was an absolutely frigid day in downtown Saskatoon, and both mom and baby were just absolutely resilient and holding poses and then running to the vehicle to warm up between takes. And it was really incredible to witness the process of it, because I wasn't the photographer. I could just aid in the process itself, and kind of helped to direct, but more so gave to Neil the idea of what I wanted, and then she would formulate the shot. But also this idea that I was creating this armor, or this regalia, and when the wearers put it on, and this happened in almost every shoot, that their stance changed, that their shoulders, you know, they were standing up straight and proud and shoulders back, and they were just ready for whatever it took for these shoots. And I think it's a testament to the work itself being successful, that if they weren't comfortable with what I was adorning them in, then this was an absolute fail. So it was really beautiful to see that play out in the process and in the photo shoots themselves.
Mhm. It's also
Yes.
one of the things, also just bring it back to this idea of place, and that, you know, the
Mhm.
first images we saw were very rural. This is very urban, obviously. And I know
Yeah.
that you were interested in thinking about what land is, right? And,
Yeah.
you know, wherever people live, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Challenging that perception of place and of indigenousness, right? And like, how do people see us, right, as contemporary Indigenous people, and the fact that we occupy all different sorts of places and spaces, and where we're not heard, well, maybe I wanted to insert us in that space to say something more about that as well. So again, kind of referencing again those more historical photos, and like the Edward Curtis that I mentioned before, and really wanting to just like completely smash that perception and create something very vibrant and contemporary and aesthetically, visually appealing. And at one point, I remember kind of thinking about it in terms of how we're misrepresented or not represented so often. And one way is through like these dolls, like when you're a little girl and you go to the store and there's like Barbie and fair skinned babies, and you don't see yourself represented in those ways. And so I was thinking of these women being presented as these like real life Indigenous GI Joe figures that are just like badass and you know, conquering these stereotypes and being powerful in that way. So it was kind of like always in my mind that to create something that was cohesive, that how do I say that, like I'll kind of talk about it a bit more as I go through these slides, but visualizing this pop culture reference. And for me, that came with the apparel that also came under the garments. That played a huge role in how I visually set up this image. So having her in these leggings and then mimicking the legging shape and color into that chest piece, and then having the cradle board focus the syllabics on the back of the cradle board, so that still has presence and pops from the rest of it, like all very like visually conceptualizing all of this. But the flip side of that was that once I put those beads down and once I melt them, there's no going back from those hours of work. So it was like, that constant play of, am I doing the right thing? Is this going to work? Is this, but also trusting the photographer and that she will, she has an eye for that too. And she'll set it up in a way that we can make that all happen. So, and Tennille took many different shots. It was very hard to choose the photos that I chose to be exhibited in this work. This was another one she had taken that I absolutely adore. Fell in love with this photo, but it came down to diluting it to what am I trying to say within each portrait. And how much can I say without overwhelming the viewer with, all these 9 portraits hung in the gallery space along with the armor. So going through that image or that process of selection was a tough one too, because I mean, you can't deny that this is another beauty photo. So I just wanted to include it for the close-ups of the work itself. And then the earrings were a collaboration with Melanie Parsons, also known as Savage Rose, her jewelry business, and she created those for me using the mini perler beads. So I thought the perler beads were difficult. No. So yeah, it was pretty amazing work, and lovely that it all came together. I'd give a little bit of direction on what I thought would work, and then she had the creative momentum to design the way she wanted, but maybe it was like the color palette that I suggested or some such thing. And then the choker that Devin's wearing is actually traditional glass beads. And it's syllabics for, let me get this right now, it's been a while. I believe it's the syllabics for mother in Dene, and the cradle board was my mother in Cree syllabics. So this one is, sorry if you hear that noise outside. Let that pass. So this is a portrait of that includes my good friends, Kirsten and Erica Ryder, both from Morley, Alberta. And it's titled Warriors of the Rocks. And the medallions read Strong Spirits in Stoney Nakoda, which is their native tongue. And they're sisters and members of the Stoney Nakoda, I already mentioned that nation. Kirsten is the director of training and development for their band, and Erica is an educational assistant at Morley Elementary School in the special needs class. Both are also mothers. And so this was another insane shoot where we had them walk out into the water, freezing water. And they were insanely resilient and held their pose, and they spent, I don't even know, maybe 20 minutes in the frigid cold holding poses. So this is the one that I ended up choosing, and they were all very powerful shots, but this one for me referenced water protectors and land protectors in a sense, and I was really intrigued by how the medallions themselves touch the water or just skim the surface. And for me, it almost looks like these straws that are feeding the water back into their bodies. So yeah, it was another beautiful photo shoot.
And the fluorescence of the tape too.
yeah. I think I was also like, I was obsessed with that reflective tape at the time. I knew I wanted to incorporate it. I had plans on incorporating it in more garments, but this is the only one it really shows up in, I think. And again, it's like that visibility I'm speaking to, or the non-representation or no visibility, right? So it was like, in whatever way I could like make something pop more was important if it worked, right? So this it worked in these medallions, so I went with it. But so this is just another process shot of kind of how some ideas would formulate, and that's let me get this right now. Women's fancy shawl on the left, top left. So taking that idea of a dance regalia, that's all beaded, so incredible work. And then the right-hand side is an Inuit amati. I hope I'm saying that right. And these garments were often used. There's different styles. So there would be like a kid's amati, a woman's, a men's. And the one that I was referencing was a woman's amati, and that was you'll see them where they carry their child in the hood of it. And so I was really taking certain aspects of that design mixed with aspects of the shawl to create the piece at the bottom for the next work. And as well, I incorporated plastic bag for the shawl, the pieces that hang from the shawl. My goal was to only use plastic in the majority of these works, because I was working with a plastic material. I was speaking to this mass consumption of plastic and plastic waste in our society, and commenting on or evolving it to speak back to this adaptability or innovation of indigenous art and garment making. So I tried to keep it to plastic as much as I could. I think the only things that aren't are the straps in the back that adjust it to fit the models themselves. So this is Katrina Eaglechild, also known as Mother of Mobilization for this work. Katrina is a youth coordinator in our community of Pachinak. She is also the mother of 3 beautiful children. And she's wearing a medallion that reads mother in sign language. So I tried to, I speak a little bit about that later too, but I really wanted to exemplify or highlight different languages and that diversity again through the medallions themselves. And if I could make it somewhat more personal for the wearer, then that was the intention behind the medallion design. Another kind of process shot. Like I mentioned earlier, because of this overwhelming diversity and historical context, I was getting really lost in the direction of certain pieces. And that's when this idea of collaboration kind of sprung about, and why wouldn't I utilize other Indigenous designers in this work if I could, and have their voices speak through it as well. And so in some works, the futuristic form came first, and then I inserted this more traditional aspect to come to these pieces, and then vice versa in other works. It was based on more traditional aspects, and then throwing in that futuristic flair to come to the final structure. So this piece on the far right is the piece I created. And it is worn on the Churchill Challenger, which I don't know if I've included in this, but this is it on the runway. So my work got invited onto runway kind of shortly after it went into exhibition. It was invited onto runway show for Indigenous Fashion Week Toronto. And then after that for Otapiaki Fashion Week in Calgary. And so this is an image from one of the runway shows. And so I'm just going to go back really quick again. So that work there on the right that I've created was in collaboration with this person here, Alano Adzerza. Alano is, I do have his information here, Taltan. He's a multimedia artist and entrepreneur based in Vancouver. And I approached Alano after seeing his work here on the left, Birth of the Beaver Clan. And I wanted to incorporate his work and collaborate with him to create that piece. So I just wasn't pulling from anywhere, and I could be respectful of that. And so he was on board. He was more than happy. And he also passed along the garments that some of the models wore underneath of the piece I created. So it was a beautiful collaboration. Oh, I did include it. Here it is here. So some of the works differ from the exhibition. How they are seen on runway differs from how they are seen in exhibition. So here it's my work showcased, or our work is showcased on, you know, a black shirt, just to make that work pop more and to draw the focus for this torso shot. And this is my sister, Christina Duffy, also known as the Churchill Challenger. Her medallion, KAA, for Kick-Ass Auntie, because she is also that. And yeah, she was, again, a trooper. This was like minus 35 degrees, I think, in Saskatoon, something crazy like that. And she stood pretty solid. Just another example, collaboration. This is with artist Tessa Sayers using her pattern called My Calling Us Culture on the left. And this would have been the start of one of my designs on the right. It often my patterns and designs would change dramatically from where I started. I would sometimes make a piece and then hold it up to the mannequin form to see how it would wrap around the body and then know where to go from there. So this went from, like, originally it was going to be a blanket piece hung over an arm. And then it changed completely when I wrapped it around the mannequin and saw this more bustier-like piece start to emerge. And then on the right, you can see how the shoulders have changed since the piece on the left to kind of give it this like flight, this like bird-like kind of feel to it. And that to me really read like superhero-esque. And so that's it on the Toronto Indigenous Fashion Runway in 2018.
It's so interesting, like I guess I keep thinking about how these are so futuristic in some ways, and you know, I think what's interesting is the questioning process that you had throughout, and that collaboration was always the answer to sort of where should these go, right? And thinking about the future, we still need to think about the past and to do that collaboratively, right? To think,
right.
So it's like a very, each piece sort of strikes me, you sort of come down to the same questions, right? Like,
yeah. And how does it how do those things inform, like you say, the future, right? Like taking the past and the present and making sure too that I was making that leap into the future, right? Because that was the whole tone of the show, was this continued presence into the future. And so, yeah, constant questioning there. And also, I didn't mention in this piece too that there was another collaboration just with the dress underneath that model. I'm blanking right now on her name, I apologize. But I used two of her dresses in this work as well. Stender, Lisa Stender, I believe.
And yeah, so even though they're futuristic, they're still you've made them to be worn, right? So
So this particular slide, the photo on the left is my grandmother's mukluk, the back of one of the mukluks she had made for me. And my grandmother created in floral motif and also geometric design. And so it tended to be more geometric later in her life. And so I had taken components of her work and incorporated them into the piece on the right. And you can kind of see some of the arrows and those blocked checker-like pieces coming into play in the top half. And then really honoring my grandmother. And one way I thought would kind of be fun was this portrait of her. And it's kind of cool. My parents helped me make that actually when I was living back in Saskatchewan. I rallied the troops to get some of this work done, and they were busy creating the portrait with me. So that was also a nice collaboration in that sense. And then this slide, so this is my good friend Nikina Weaselhead, also known as Captain Kainaiwa, with her partner Susanna. And I wanted to include this slide in particular. Oh, sorry, my dog. To illuminate Indigenous female identities within this body of work. Identities and experiences to surpass these certain gender binaries that we're so used to, you know, being represented by, because the Indigenous communities are often include two-spirited, non-binary people, and so I wanted to showcase that, include that, represent that in this body of work as well. And I also wanted Nikina and her partner to feel not, how do I say it? I guess just not in competition with each other within the frame itself, that they're both represented at the same level, hence they're both standing. But also trying to differentiate that Nikina is the focus in this photo. And so it was, it took some time to kind of figure out how I would go about that. But of course, the end result was that she wore the actual regalia or armor, and Susanna did not. But still figuring out what worked best in terms of giving Susanna presence within the frame as well. And so I was looking back at, again, old historical photos where, you know, the man, typically the man is sitting and the woman is behind, whereas in my photo they're both standing, and there's still that aspect of a relationship, right, with her arm wrapped around. So yeah, it was important for me to include that as well. And I also like really worked with the models in certain cases, well, in all cases, but more so in certain collaborations. So with Nikina, she was a bit more shy to get involved, and I really let her take her time with it, and of course didn't force anything. And eventually she was like, yeah, I think I want to do this, like I want to be involved. And so it was about knowing that balance on how to make everyone comfortable within this shoot, but also have them understand on this grander level of what this work is representative of. And it was hard at the time because I hadn't finished any, you know, of the work. It was still all being made as I was scheduling these photo shoots. So I was like, don't worry, you'll look great, it'll be great. But I was like, oh my goodness, like, please trust me. So it was really a testament to that trust too, that all of these models and friends and family had with me. And so I wanted to represent Nikina's love and passion for sport and basketball. And so we had this talk about, and this happened with the majority of the models, but, oh, sorry. Oh, sorry, there we go. how this relationship to identity and how she sees herself and how she wants to be represented. And we talked a little bit about her experience as a basketball player and on a team, and kind of her role within the team. And she thought of her role as like being this bridger of two worlds with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people on her team, and that she could help unify or start that dialogue in a different, more sports-oriented way. And so hence why I have MVP as her medallion, just kind of representative of that aspect, and kind of a more athletic chess piece in terms of like, it's kind of representative of you know, those sports, what do you call them, like padding for football or whatnot. And so that was also a way that we could kind of, I was like, it's okay, I'm gonna make it like this and it'll be kind of sporty. And she's like, okay, like that's cool. So there's ways of like working through all of these yeah, ways of seeing ourselves too, right? And again leads back to that idea of the power of dress and how it's transformative. These are just some close-ups of the medallion pieces that accompanied the armor pieces themselves, or the outfits. So some are Indigenous languages, others are acronyms. I'm just gonna see my notes here for a second. And yeah, this is, I mentioned it earlier, but I was fortunate to have this work debut on the Toronto Indigenous Fashion Week runway. And then afterwards it was in the Otapayaki runway, as well as the Santa Fe Haute Couture runway in New Mexico. And so it was really incredible to see this work in movement, because I had it on the body for the portraits themselves, but then to see it take on a whole other form, you know, moving down the runway, being worn. And again, how these models just encompass the power. They just exemplified everything that work was meant to do. And yeah, it made me so happy to witness that again, that I was successful in that sense of achieving that goal, you know.
It's also unusual, you know, when you think of an exhibition, and even in the exhibition, you have the garments and then the photographs, but to have this other level as well out in the world, that, you know, that it was in kind of like worn and moving at one point as well.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
in these different ways, it sort of adds an element that you don't have with most exhibitions, right?
Right.
Because it's
right.
wearable. Yeah.
Yeah, and also why it's included in the exhibition itself too is important to include a video segment of that happening,
Right.
because it also speaks to this idea of Indigenous, you know, understanding that all objects have life, that they're breathing, living things, that there's life beyond just, you know, a gallery space and seeing them in that setting, or in a museum space, that they were meant to be worn and used and cared for and loved in so many different ways. So just another runway shot. And then kind of leads me into some more current work. This was work from 2019 titled "With These Hands from This Land." This is an install shot in the college galleries in Saskatoon. And this is for residency work. The culmination of that residency work was this show. And as part of this show, I really wanted to examine tools and explore the functionality of tools, but also the objectivity of tools. And like I just mentioned previous, this idea that Indigenous understanding is that everything holds life and is living. And so I really wanted to free the pieces from cases and from this like museological way of looking at objects, and Indigenous objects specifically in this historical context, and to just remove them from that to be seen in these, you know, open settings, so you can really look at them. And it was really interesting because a lot of my family came to this opening, or more family than usual, and right away, like certain people didn't want to touch, right? It's a gallery setting, you don't touch the work. And then my family came flooding in and they're like, grandma's rock, oh my God. And they're like, I haven't seen this since whenever. And uncles were touching certain pieces. And it just, yeah, it made me laugh a little bit, because I mean, that really was the path that I wanted this work to take. And so these are some of my grandmother's hide scraping tools. And then in the middle is her rock that she used to pound dry meat into pemmican, which is just the process of taking dried meat and pounding it into a more like grinding it basically. And then pemmican was historically made into these balls using animal fat and berries, and they were easy to preserve in that sense. And so they're a great like food for that type of nomadic lifestyle. And so grandma would bring this rock when she'd come to visit us, no matter where we were. And she knew that my favorite thing was pemmican. So she would often bring this rock and set up her tarp in the basement and be pounding this pemmican meat for me. And it has I have a personal attachment to that piece itself in the center. And then my cousins, who are now hide tanners and learning that themselves, the traditional techniques, were really, you know, intrigued by the scraping tools seen on the left and right plinths. And then one way that I wanted to reflect this more contemporary notion to the work was to redesign my grandma's florals. And so my friend, who's a graphic designer, helped me to create these wallpaper or vinyls for the front of the plinths. And that was a way of like kind of reflecting these two worlds, you know, coming together, and yeah, speaking to a presence, or a contemporary presence in this work. This is just a close-up of the pemmican rock. I was thinking about Indigenous knowledges and stories in this work, and I guess reiterating that Indigenous understanding that all things hold energy and hold power, and so focusing on that throughout this. This is another piece in the show. I'm not going to attempt to say it because I don't speak Dene and I will butcher it, but the English title of this would be, Can You Say It Again? And it's kind of a two-part, I guess. There's a photo you see hanging on the wall of me and my mother, and we're wearing the headsets. And then the headsets themselves that you see in the foreground here are playing a dialogue that is emitting from the plinth itself. And it's a dialogue me and my mother are having, where she is teaching me Dene words, or the Dene language, and I'm repeating it. And yeah, it was really a focus on tools, like I mentioned, but also seeing tools in different perspectives and different lights, and the fact that like headsets are a tool. Online learning in terms of learning Indigenous languages is a tool, contemporary tool. But I was also really interested in the disconnect that happens between the two during the learning aspect of this, which is that things are lost in translation, or the intonation of words are not always accurate or in the right dialect. And so it was this constant, like, how do I learn the language if I'm not surrounded by it? And someone might say, well, you go to the online learning tool. Well, what if the tool is not in the right dialect? And it becomes this very complex way of understanding and learning language, and how hands-on that really is, right? To the need to be surrounded by it to fully grasp it. So, yeah.
Mhm.
And that's just a close-up. So I just beaded the tops of the headsets, and the one closest to us says "like this" with a question mark, and then the other headset has just beaded question marks all along it. So kind of making visual that dialogue that was happening. And there was a lot of laughter also involved in the making of this work, which was really important too. Uh-oh, my battery. Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
That's a sign.
That's the sign.
Yeah. But yeah, it was a nice moment for me and my mother to have the making of this work. So, and this was another piece from it called Trapline.
Mhm.
And I'm speaking to both my grandfather's history of being a trapper, fisherman, provider in that sense, and inserting also my grandmother's feminine touch in terms of adornment. And so the blood dripping from the traps is actually all beads, and the beads pool there to mimic blood, and the pink just adding a little bit more of a feminine flair to it. And so it becomes a reflection of both of those worlds and processes and identities and all of it.